The child stumbled out of the snowstorm with a dying dog pressed against her chest, her voice cracking as she begged a stranger to save the only thing she had left in the world. Elijah Thorne hadn't cared about anything in 5 years, but tonight he would stay awake until dawn with blood on his hands, fighting to keep a wounded animal alive for a little girl who had already lost everything. Before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, like the video, and comment where in the world you're watching from. Let's go. The October wind howled across the high country of Montana, carrying with it the first bitter promise of winter. Elijah Thorne stood on the porch of his ranch house, watching the last rays of sunlight disappear behind the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains. At 53, he had seen more winters than he cared to count, each one leaving its mark on his weathered face and graying hair. The ranch had been his father's before him, and his grandfather's before that. 3 generations of Thornes carving out a life from this unforgiving land. But for the past 5 years, since Sarah had passed, the house had grown quieter with each season, the silence pressing in like the snow that would soon blanket the valley. He turned to go inside when movement on the road caught his attention. Someone was approaching on foot, a small figure struggling against the wind, moving with desperate urgency despite an obvious burden. Elijah squinted into the gathering darkness, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle that always hung beside the door. The frontier had taught him caution, but it had also taught him something else. The trouble often wore the face of someone in need. As the figure drew closer, he realized it was a child. A girl, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, her thin dress and worn coat wholly inadequate for the dropping temperature. But what made his heart clench was what she carried in her arms. A dog, wrapped in what appeared to be a blood-stained blanket, its head lolling weakly against her shoulder. The girl was crying, her sobs carrying on the wind even before she reached the gate, and something in the sound reminded Elijah of grief so profound it transcended age or circumstance. He was off the porch and striding toward her before he had consciously decided to move. The girl saw him coming and her pace quickened, stumbling over the rutted path but somehow keeping her grip on the injured animal. When she reached him, she looked up with eyes that were red-rimmed from tears and wild with desperation, the kind of desperation that comes from having nowhere else to turn. "Please, sir," she gasped, her voice cracking with exhaustion and fear. "Please, he's all I have left. You have to help him. Please." Elijah looked down at the bundle in her arms. The dog was a young hound, maybe 2 years old, with a brown and white coat now matted with dried blood. Its breathing was shallow and labored, and when he gently pulled back the blanket, he saw the wound, a deep gash along its side, the kind of injury that came from a predator's claws or a man's cruelty. The dog whimpered softly, its eyes rolling up to meet his with a look that seemed almost human in its pain and trust. "What happened?" he asked, already reaching to take the animal from her trembling arms. "Coyotes," she whispered. We were walking, trying to find somewhere safe, and they came out of nowhere. Rusty fought them off, but they hurt him so bad, and I didn't know what to do, and someone in town said you were good with animals, and I walked and walked, and please, sir, please don't let him die." The words tumbled out in a desperate rush, punctuated by sobs that shook her thin frame. Elijah took the dog carefully, feeling the rapid flutter of its heartbeat against his palms. The animal was in bad shape, no question about that. But there was still life in those brown eyes, still a will to fight that he recognized from years of working with creatures who had been given up for dead. "Come inside," he said, his voice gruff but not unkind. "Both of you, you'll freeze out here." The girl followed him without hesitation, too exhausted to question the stranger who was carrying her only friend toward an uncertain fate. Inside, the ranch house was warm from the fire Elijah had built earlier, and the girl seemed to sag with relief as the heat washed over her. He noticed then how thin she was, how her clothes hung on her frame like they belonged to someone larger, how her shoes were worn through at the toes. This was not a child who had simply wandered away from a comfortable home. He laid the dog on the kitchen table, pushing aside the dishes from his solitary supper without a second thought. The lamp cast a warm golden glow over the scene as he began to examine the wound more closely. It was deep but clean, the coyote's claws having sliced through muscle but missing the vital organs. If he could stop the bleeding and prevent infection, the dog had a chance. A slim chance, perhaps, but a chance nonetheless. "I need hot water," he said to the girl. "There's a kettle on the stove. Can you bring it to me?" She nodded, wiping her tears with the back of her hand, clearly grateful to have something useful to do. While she fetched the water, Elijah gathered his supplies from the cabinet where he kept his veterinary equipment. He had always been the one the ranchers called when their animals were sick or injured, a skill he had learned from necessity rather than formal training. Sarah used to say he had healing hands, that animals trusted him because they sensed the gentleness beneath his rough exterior. He wondered if that was still true, or if 5 years of solitude had hardened him beyond recognition. The girl returned with the kettle, her hands shaking as she set it on the table. She looked at the dog, at the blood still seeping slowly from the wound, and her face crumpled. "Is he going to die?" she asked, her voice barely a whisper. Elijah looked at her, at the terror in her eyes, and he understood that this question was about more than just the dog. This child had already lost something, perhaps everything, and the animal on his table represented the last thread connecting her to whatever life she had known before. "Not if I can help it," he said, and he meant it as a promise to both of them. "Now tell me your name, child, and tell me where you came from." The girl swallowed hard, her eyes never leaving her dog. "My name is Lucy," she said. "Lucy Brennan, and I came from nowhere, because nowhere is all I have left." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with a sorrow that Elijah recognized all too well. He had felt that way himself after Sarah died, like he belonged nowhere, connected to nothing, adrift in a world that had suddenly become unrecognizable. But there was no time for such reflections now. The dog's breathing was growing more labored, and outside the window, the first snowflakes of the season had begun to fall. Elijah worked through the evening with steady hands and focused concentration, drawing on every bit of knowledge he had accumulated over 3 decades of tending to injured animals. The wound was worse than he had initially thought, the coyote's claws having torn through layers of muscle and nicking a blood vessel that required careful attention to close. Lucy sat beside the table on a wooden stool he had pulled from the corner, her small hand resting on Rusty's head, stroking the soft fur between his ears with a tenderness that spoke of deep and abiding love. The dog remained conscious throughout the procedure, his brown eyes moving between Lucy and Elijah with an awareness that seemed almost supernatural. When Elijah cleaned the wound with whiskey, the only disinfectant he had on hand, the animal whimpered but did not snap or struggle. When he threaded the needle to begin stitching the torn flesh back together, Rusty simply watched, trusting this stranger with his life because the girl he loved had brought him here. "You're a brave one," Elijah murmured to the dog as he worked. "Your girl chose well bringing you to me. Don't you give up now." "He won't," Lucy said fiercely. "Rusty never gives up. When the coyotes came, he put himself between them and me. He didn't even hesitate. He just fought, even when there were 3 of them and only 1 of him." Elijah glanced at her, noting the scratches on her arms that he hadn't seen before, the torn hem of her dress, the way she favored her left ankle when she moved. The coyotes had gone after her too, and this dog had defended her with everything he had. In that moment, looking at the injured animal and the desperate child, Elijah felt something shift in his chest, a wall he had built around his heart beginning to crack. "Those scratches on your arms," he said as he continued stitching, "we should clean those too once I'm finished here." "They don't matter," Lucy said quickly. "Only Rusty matters." "You both matter," Elijah replied, and the words surprised him with their truth. He had spent 5 years convincing himself that nothing mattered anymore, that he was simply marking time until he joined Sarah in whatever came after this life. But looking at this girl and her dog, he felt the first stirrings of something he had thought was dead, the instinct to protect, to care, to matter to someone again. The stitching took nearly an hour, each one placed with meticulous care to ensure the wound would heal properly. When he finally tied off the last thread and sat back, his shoulders aching from hunching over the table, the dog's breathing had steadied and some of the tension had gone out of his body. He wasn't out of danger yet, Infection was still a risk, and he had lost a significant amount of blood, but the immediate crisis had passed. "He's going to need rest," Elijah said, wiping his hands on a clean cloth, "lots of it, and someone to watch over him through the night. Make sure the wound doesn't open up again." "I'll do it," Lucy said immediately. "I'll stay awake all night if I have to." Elijah studied her face in the lamplight, seeing the exhaustion that lay beneath her determination. This child had walked miles through the cold, carrying a wounded dog that must have weighed nearly as much as she did. She was running on nothing but love and fear, and both would fail her eventually. "We'll take turns," he said, "but first, you need to eat something. When was the last time you had a proper meal?" Lucy's silence was answer enough. Elijah rose from his chair, his knees protesting after so long in one position, and moved to the stove where a pot of stew had been sitting since supper. He ladled out a generous portion and set it in front of the girl, along with a thick slice of bread and a glass of fresh milk from his dairy cow. "Eat," he said. "It's not fancy, but it's filling, and your dog needs you strong." The girl hesitated, her eyes darting between the food and Rusty, clearly torn between her hunger and her need to keep watch. Finally, nature won out over worry, and she picked up the spoon with trembling hands. She ate quickly at first, the way hungry children do when they don't know where their next meal is coming from, then slowed as the warmth of the food began to work its magic. While she ate, Elijah prepared a bed for the dog near the fire, using old blankets that had once belonged to his own dogs, animals that had died years ago and never been replaced. He moved Rusty carefully, supporting the injured side, and settled him onto the soft pile with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his large, work-roughened hands. The dog licked his fingers once, a gesture of gratitude that made Elijah's throat tighten unexpectedly. "Thank you," Lucy said from the table, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know how I'll ever repay you, but I promise I'll find a way." Elijah looked at her, this small, fierce child who had walked through the wilderness to save her only friend, and shook his head. "Some things don't need repaying," he said. "Now finish your supper, and then we'll see about those scratches." As the night deepened and the snow continued to fall outside, Elijah tended to Lucy's wounds with the same care he had shown her dog. The scratches were superficial but painful, and she bore his ministrations with a stoicism that seemed too old for her young face. When he was finished, he wrapped a blanket around her shoulders and guided her to a chair beside Rusty's makeshift bed. "Now," he said, settling into his own chair across from her, "I think it's time you told me the truth about where you came from and why you're wandering the countryside alone with nothing but a dog and the clothes on your back." Lucy's eyes filled with tears again, but this time she didn't look away. The fire crackled between them, casting dancing shadows on the walls as she began to speak. Lucy's story came out slowly at first, like water seeping through a crack in a dam, then faster as the words found their own momentum. She had been born in a small town called Cedar Falls, about 60 miles east, the only child of Thomas and Mary Brennan. Her father had been a carpenter, a quiet man with skilled hands who could build anything from a rocking chair to a church steeple. Her mother had taken in laundry and mending, working from dawn to dusk to help make ends meet. They had never been wealthy, but they had been happy, the three of them in their small house at the edge of town, with a garden out back and chickens in the yard, and Rusty, who had been a gift from her father on her 8th birthday. He found him wandering by the road, Lucy said, her hand still resting on the sleeping dog's head. Just a puppy, half-starved and covered in burrs. Papa said he looked like he needed a family, and maybe we needed him too. He was right about that. The happiness had lasted until the previous spring, when her father had fallen from a roof he was repairing and broken his back. He had lingered for 3 weeks, growing weaker each day, while Lucy and her mother sat by his bedside and prayed for a miracle that never came. When he finally passed, it was quietly, in his sleep, with Lucy's hand in his and a peaceful expression on his face that she would remember for the rest of her life. Mama tried to keep things going after that, Lucy continued, her voice growing smaller. She worked even harder, taking in more laundry, staying up late to finish mending. But it wasn't enough. The bills kept coming, and the money kept running out. And then she got sick. The sickness had started as a cough, nothing serious, her mother had said. But it had grown worse through the summer, settling deep in her chest until she could barely breathe without pain. By autumn, Mary Brennan was bedridden, and Lucy was doing her best to care for her, while also trying to earn what little money she could by running errands for the neighbors. It hadn't been enough. It was never enough. "She died 3 weeks ago," Lucy whispered. "The doctor said it was consumption. He said there was nothing anyone could have done. But I think she died because she was tired, you know. Tired of fighting, tired of worrying about me, tired of missing Papa. I think she just decided it was time to go be with him again." Elijah listened in silence, his heart aching for this child who had lost so much in such a short time. He knew that kind of grief, the kind that hollows you out from the inside until you feel like nothing but a shell going through the motions of living. He had felt it himself when Sarah died, and there were days when he still felt it, a phantom pain that never quite went away. "What happened after your mother passed?" he asked gently. Lucy's expression hardened, a flicker of anger breaking through the sadness. "The town council met to decide what to do with me," she said. "Since I had no family left, they said I was a ward of the community. They were going to send me to an orphanage in Helena, a place where they take in children who have nowhere else to go. They said it would be good for me, that I'd have food and shelter and other children to play with." She paused, her jaw tightening. "But they said I couldn't bring Rusty. The orphanage doesn't allow dogs," they said. "They wanted to take him to the livery stable, maybe sell him to someone who needed a hunting hound, or worse." "So you ran," Elijah said. It wasn't a question. Lucy nodded. "The night before they were supposed to take me to Helena, I packed what I could carry and we left. I thought maybe I could find work somewhere, on a farm or in a store. I'm small, but I'm strong, and I know how to work hard. Mama taught me that." She looked up at him with eyes that were far too old for her young face. "We walked for days, staying off the main roads so no one would find us. I found food where I could, berries and apples from trees, sometimes scraps from behind restaurants when we passed through towns. It wasn't much, but it was enough. And then yesterday, we were crossing through a valley when the coyotes came." The rest of the story Elijah already knew. The attack, the desperate fight, Rusty's injuries, the long walk to find help. What he hadn't known, what he understood now, was the full weight of what this child had been carrying. She wasn't just trying to save her dog, she was trying to save the last piece of her family, the only living creature left in the world who loved her and whom she loved in return. The fire had burned low while she spoke, and Elijah rose to add another log. The flames leaped up, casting new light across the room, illuminating the sleeping dog and the exhausted girl who watched over him. Outside, the snow was falling harder now, blanketing the world in white silence. "You're safe here," Elijah said finally, settling back into his chair. "Both of you, at least until we figure out what comes next." Lucy looked at him with desperate hope. "You mean you won't send us away? You won't tell the authorities where I am?" Elijah thought about the empty rooms in his house, the silence that had pressed in on him for 5 long years, the way his life had shrunk down to nothing but work and sleep and waiting for an end that never seemed to come. Then he looked at this brave, broken child and her loyal dog, and he made a decision that surprised even himself. "I mean, you can stay as long as you need to," he said. "Winter's coming on fast, and no child should be wandering the roads in weather like this. We'll worry about the rest when the snow melts." The tears that spilled down Lucy's cheeks then were different from the ones that had come before. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of something that might have been the first fragile stirrings of hope. She didn't speak, couldn't speak, but the look she gave him said everything that words could not. The night stretched on, marked by the steady tick of the grandfather clock in the corner and the occasional pop and hiss of the fire. True to her word, Lucy refused to sleep, keeping her vigil beside Rusty with a determination that bordered on stubbornness. Elijah stayed with her, dozing fitfully in his chair but waking at every sound, his eyes immediately going to the dog to check for signs of distress. Somewhere around midnight, Rusty's breathing grew labored again, and for a terrible hour, Elijah thought they might lose him despite everything. He changed the bandages, applied a poultice of herbs that Sarah had taught him to make years ago, and spoke softly to the animal in the tone he used with frightened horses. Lucy held Rusty's head in her lap, whispering promises and pleas that were equal parts prayer and desperation. And slowly, gradually, the crisis passed. The dog's breathing steadied, his eyes lost their glassy look, and by the time the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the windows, he had fallen into a natural sleep that spoke of healing rather than decline. "He's going to be all right," Elijah said, and for the first time he truly believed it. "He's a fighter, your Rusty. Got a will to live stronger than most creatures I've seen." Lucy's smile was like sunrise after a long dark night. "I told you he never gives up," she said. "He's the bravest dog in the whole world." Looking at her in the pale morning light, Elijah saw just how young she really was beneath the dirt and exhaustion and premature wisdom that hardship had etched into her features. She was still a child, despite everything she had endured, and children needed more than just shelter and food. They needed someone to watch over them, to guide them, to show them that the world could be kind as well as cruel. The thought stirred something uncomfortable in his chest, a sense of responsibility he hadn't felt in years. After Sarah died, he had systematically cut himself off from the community, declining invitations, avoiding town gatherings, becoming the hermit on the hill that people whispered about but rarely approached. It had been easier that way, keeping everyone at a distance where they couldn't remind him of what he had lost. But this girl and her dog had breached his defenses without even trying, simply by showing up on his doorstep with nothing but need and trust. "You should get some real sleep now," he said gruffly, pushing himself up from his chair. "There's a bedroom at the top of the stairs, second door on the right. The bed's made up, and there are extra blankets in the chest at the foot." Lucy hesitated, her eyes going to Rusty. "What if he needs me? I'll watch him. If anything changes, I'll wake you straight away. But you'll be no good to him if you collapse from exhaustion, and that's where you're headed if you don't rest." The practicality of the argument seemed to convince her where reassurances had not. She leaned down to press a kiss to Rusty's forehead, whispered something Elijah couldn't hear, and then rose unsteadily to her feet. At the bottom of the stairs, she paused and looked back at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "Mr. Thorne," she said, "just Elijah is fine." "Elijah, then." She swallowed hard. "Thank you, not just for saving Rusty, but for everything. For letting us stay, for not asking too many questions, for being kind when you didn't have to be." He didn't know how to respond to gratitude so earnest and unguarded. In his experience, people rarely said what they meant, and when they did, it was usually because they wanted something. But Lucy seemed to want nothing more than what she had already been given, and somehow that made her thanks harder to accept than suspicion would have been. "Get some sleep," he said again, and turned back to the fire so she wouldn't see the emotion on his face. After she had gone upstairs, Elijah sat alone with the sleeping dog and his own tangled thoughts. The snow had stopped sometime during the night, and through the window he could see the world transformed, every surface covered in pristine white that sparkled in the early light. It was beautiful, the kind of beauty that Sarah had always loved, and for a moment he let himself remember how she would stand at this very window on mornings like this, her face alight with wonder at the simple magic of a winter dawn. They had tried for children, he and Sarah, in the early years of their marriage. It hadn't happened, despite their hopes and prayers and the various remedies the doctor had suggested. Eventually, they had accepted that it wasn't meant to be, that their family would consist of just the two of them, plus whatever animals wandered onto their land needing care. Sarah had been philosophical about it, saying that love wasn't diminished by being concentrated rather than spread around. But Elijah had always wondered what it would have been like to have a child, to watch a young life grow and learn and become something new. Now, unexpectedly, there was a child under his roof, a child who needed protection, guidance, and a place to belong. He told himself it was temporary, that once the winter passed and Rusty was fully healed, they would need to figure out a proper solution. He couldn't just keep her here indefinitely, a single man raising someone else's daughter. People would talk, questions would be asked, and eventually the authorities would come looking for the orphan who had run away from their care. But as he watched the fire burn down to embers and listened to the deep, steady breathing of the dog who had fought coyotes to protect his girl, Elijah found himself wondering if temporary was really what he wanted. The house felt different this morning, less empty, less silent. There was life here again, purpose and need, and the possibility of something he had thought was lost forever. He was still wrestling with these thoughts when Rusty opened his eyes and looked at him. The dog's gaze was clear and alert, all traces of the previous night's crisis gone. His tail thumped weakly against the blankets, a greeting and a thank you, all wrapped into one simple gesture. "You're welcome," Elijah said softly. And then, surprising himself, he smiled. The days that followed settled into a rhythm that felt both foreign and familiar to Elijah. Lucy woke each morning before dawn, a habit born from years of helping her mother with chores, and by the time Elijah came downstairs, she had already stoked the fire and put water on for coffee. She moved through his kitchen with a quiet efficiency that reminded him of Sarah, finding things in drawers and cabinets as if she had always known where they belonged. It should have felt like an intrusion, this small person reorganizing his solitary existence, but instead, it felt like something finally clicking into place. Rusty improved steadily, his wound healing with the remarkable resilience that animals possess when they have something to live for. Within 3 days, he was able to stand on his own, and by the end of the first week, he was walking carefully around the house, his tail wagging whenever Lucy came into view. Elijah changed the bandages twice daily, checking for signs of infection, and marveling at how cleanly the tissue was knitting back together. The dog would carry a scar for the rest of his life, a jagged line along his ribs that would tell the story of his bravery to anyone who cared to look. But he would live, and that was what mattered. Lucy threw herself into helping around the ranch with an intensity that sometimes worried Elijah. She fed the chickens, collected eggs, swept floors, and scrubbed dishes without being asked, as if she feared that any moment of idleness might give him reason to send her away. He tried to tell her that she didn't need to earn her keep, that her presence was enough, but she would just nod and then find some other task to occupy her hands. Work was her way of showing gratitude, he realized, and taking that away from her would be its own kind of cruelty. In the evenings, after supper had been eaten and the dishes washed, they would sit by the fire together while Rusty dozed on his blankets. At first, the silence between them was awkward, two strangers who had been thrown together by circumstance and weren't sure how to navigate the space they now shared. But gradually, tentatively, they began to talk. Lucy told him more about her parents, about the small house in Cedar Falls and the garden her mother had tended, about her father's workshop where the smell of sawdust had permeated everything. Elijah listened without interrupting, understanding that she needed to speak these memories aloud to keep them alive. In return, he found himself telling her about Sarah. He hadn't spoken her name to another person in years, had locked away his memories of her like precious things too fragile to be exposed to light. But something about Lucy's patient, attentive silence made the words come easier than he had expected. He told her about how they had met at a church social when he was 22 and she was 19, how he had known from the first moment he saw her that she was the one he wanted to spend his life with. He told her about their wedding, simple but joyous, and about the early years of their marriage when everything had seemed possible and the future stretched out before them like an endless summer. "She sounds wonderful," Lucy said one evening, her voice soft with the particular reverence children reserve for things they sense are sacred. "You must miss her very much." "Every day," Elijah admitted, surprising himself with the honesty. "But lately, it's been different. Less like a wound and more like a scar. It still marks where the pain was, but it doesn't bleed the way it used to." Lucy considered this for a moment, absently stroking Rusty's ears. "Do you think that's what will happen with Mama and Papa? That someday I'll be able to remember them without it hurting so much?" Elijah chose his words carefully, knowing how much weight they would carry. "I think grief is like winter," he said finally. "When you're in the middle of it, it feels like it will never end. The cold goes all the way through you, and you can't imagine ever being warm again. But spring always comes, even when you've given up hoping for it. The snow melts, the ground thaws, and things start growing again. It doesn't mean winter never happened. It just means it's not the only season there is. Lucy nodded slowly, and though tears glistened in her eyes, there was something like peace in her expression. "I like that," she said. "Mama used to say something similar. She said that sorrow was just love with nowhere to go, and that eventually you learn to give it a new direction. Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was the wisest person I ever knew," Lucy said, "until I met you." The simple declaration caught Elijah off guard, touching something deep inside him that he had thought was beyond reaching. He wasn't wise, he knew. He was just old and tired and had made enough mistakes to learn a few things along the way. But if this child saw wisdom in him, perhaps that meant something. Perhaps it meant he still had something left to offer the world, some purpose beyond simply waiting for his own winter to end. The second week brought a change in the weather, the temperatures dropping sharply, and another heavy snowfall that kept them confined to the house for 3 full days. Elijah used the time to teach Lucy how to play chess, a game Sarah had loved and that he hadn't touched since her death. The girl picked it up quickly, her mind sharp and strategic in ways that continued to surprise him. By the third day, she was beating him 1 game out of every 3, and he found himself having to concentrate in a way he hadn't done in years. But the snow also brought worry. Elijah knew that their isolation couldn't last forever. Eventually, someone would come looking, whether it was neighbors checking on the hermit rancher or authorities searching for a runaway orphan. The world beyond his property line hadn't forgotten about either of them, and sooner or later, it would come knocking. The knock came on a Tuesday morning, 3 weeks after Lucy and Rusty had first appeared on Elijah's doorstep. He was in the barn tending to the horses when he heard it, a sharp, authoritative rapping that echoed across the snow-covered yard. Through the barn door, he could see 2 figures on his porch, their dark coats stark against the white landscape. His stomach tightened with apprehension even before he recognized Sheriff Tom Garrett and a man he didn't know, a thin fellow in city clothes who looked deeply uncomfortable in the rural setting. Lucy was inside, helping prepare the midday meal. She would have heard the knock, would be wondering whether to answer or hide. Elijah set down the brush he had been using and walked slowly toward the house, his mind racing through possibilities. He had known this moment would come. He just hadn't expected it to feel so much like a threat. "Sheriff Garrett," he said as he approached, keeping his voice neutral. "Something I can help you with?" The sheriff was a man Elijah had known for 30 years, a fair and decent sort who had always dealt honestly with the ranchers in his jurisdiction. But today his expression was uncomfortable, almost apologetic, and that told Elijah everything he needed to know about the nature of this visit. "Morning, Elijah," Garrett said, tipping his hat. "Mind if we come inside? It's colder than a well-digger's boots out here." Elijah considered refusing, but that would only delay the inevitable and make things worse. He nodded and led the way to the porch, opening the door to find Lucy standing in the kitchen doorway with Rusty pressed against her legs. Her face was pale but composed, and she met his eyes with a look that was equal parts fear and determination. Whatever happened next, that look said, she wouldn't run. She wouldn't leave him to face it alone. "This is Mr. Harold Pemberton," the sheriff said, gesturing to his companion as they entered. "He's from the Territorial Children's Welfare Officer in Helena. He's been looking for a young girl who went missing from Cedar Falls about a month ago." Pemberton stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Lucy with an expression of professional satisfaction. "That would be Lucy Brennan," he said, age 11, brown hair, brown eyes, last seen fleeing town with a dog. His gaze dropped to Rusty, who had begun to growl softly. "Yes, I believe we found our runaway." "She's not a runaway," Elijah said, his voice harder than he intended. "She's a child who had nowhere else to go." "Be that as it may," Pemberton replied, "she's a ward of the territory now, and there are proper channels for these things." The Cedar Falls Council arranged for her placement at St. Agnes Home for Children in Helena. She was supposed to be transported there weeks ago. Lucy's hand found Elijah's sleeve, gripping it tightly. "They were going to take Rusty away," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "They were going to separate us. He's all I have left of my family, don't you understand? I couldn't let them take him." Pemberton's expression didn't change. "The orphanage has rules, Miss Brennan. Rules exist for good reasons. You can't simply ignore them because you find them inconvenient." "Inconvenient?" Elijah felt anger rising in his chest like steam from a kettle. This child watched both her parents die within 6 months of each other. She walked 60 miles through wilderness, was attacked by coyotes, and nearly lost the only living creature left who loves her. And you call her attachment to that dog inconvenient? Sheriff Garrett shifted uncomfortably. "Now, Elijah, nobody's saying the girl hasn't had a hard time of it. But the law's the law. She's got no legal guardian, no family to take her in. The orphanage is the proper place for her. What if she did have someone to take her in?" The words came out before Elijah had consciously decided to speak them. Everyone in the room turned to look at him, including Lucy, whose grip on his sleeve tightened. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Thorne?" Pemberton asked, his tone skeptical. Elijah took a breath, feeling the weight of what he was about to say. "I'm proposing that she stay here with me. I've got room, I've got means, and she's already settled in. She's been helping around the ranch, going to bed with a full stomach every night, sleeping in a warm bed. Why uproot her again when she's finally found some stability?" Pemberton's eyebrows rose. "You're a single man, Mr. Thorne, unmarried, living alone. Surely you can see how irregular that would appear. The welfare office has standards for placement, and frankly, this situation raises questions." "Questions about what?" Elijah demanded. "About whether I can provide for her? Look around you. This ranch has been in my family for 3 generations. I've got cattle, horses, chickens, and enough land to feed a small army. She'd want for nothing here." "It's not about material provision," Pemberton said primly. "It's about propriety. A young girl needs female influence, proper supervision. What you're suggesting is highly unorthodox." Sheriff Garrett cleared his throat. "Harold, I've known Elijah Thorne since we were boys. He's the most decent man in this county, and that's not an exaggeration. If he says he'll look after this girl, he means it, and he'll do it right." The welfare official's expression remained unconvinced, but Elijah could see uncertainty creeping in around the edges. The man was a bureaucrat, more comfortable with paperwork and procedures than with the messy realities of human need. He wanted this situation to fit into a neat category, and it stubbornly refused to cooperate. "There would need to be an official process," Pemberton said slowly. "Applications, home inspections, interviews. It could take months, and in the meantime, the girl would need to be placed somewhere appropriate." "She's placed somewhere appropriate right now," Lucy spoke up, her voice stronger than before. She looked at Pemberton with a directness that seemed to unsettle him. "Mr. Thorne saved Rusty's life. He's fed me and clothed me and treated me like I matter. Nobody's done that since my parents died. Nobody except him." The room fell silent. Outside, the wind had picked up, sending small tornadoes of snow spinning across the yard. Pemberton looked from Lucy to Elijah and back again, and something in his expression shifted slightly. "I'll need to consult with my superiors," he said finally. "This is not a decision I can make on my own authority. But I suppose, given the circumstances, the girl can remain here temporarily while we sort through the proper channels." The weeks following Pemberton's visit were filled with a peculiar mixture of hope and anxiety. True to his word, the welfare official initiated the formal process for Elijah to become Lucy's legal guardian, a process that involved more paperwork than Elijah had seen in his entire life. There were forms to fill out in triplicate, questions about his income and property and moral character, requests for references from people who could vouch for his suitability as a guardian. He attacked the bureaucratic mountain with the same determined persistence he applied to everything else, refusing to let frustration deter him from the goal. Lucy threw herself into ranch work with renewed energy, as if she could somehow influence the outcome by proving how useful and well-behaved she could be. She learned to milk the dairy cow, to gather eggs without disturbing the hens, to recognize when a horse was favoring a leg or when the weather was about to turn sour. Rusty followed her everywhere, fully healed now except for the scar along his ribs, his watchful eyes always tracking her movements as if he feared she might disappear if he looked away for too long. The town of Copper Creek, the small settlement 7 miles from Elijah's ranch, began to take notice of the changes in the hermit rancher's life. Word had spread about the girl and her dog, about the night Elijah had worked for hours to save the wounded animal, about his unexpected petition for guardianship. Reactions were mixed, as they always are when small communities confront something that doesn't fit their established expectations. Some people were openly supportive. Mrs. Clara Bennett, who ran the general store, made a point of setting aside fabric and ribbons she thought Lucy might like, offering them at prices so low they were practically gifts. The Reverend James Whitfield stopped by the ranch one afternoon to offer his blessing and his assistance, saying that any man who would open his heart to an orphan was doing the Lord's work. Old Doc Patterson, the town physician who had known Elijah since he was a boy, wrote a glowing letter of recommendation that spoke of Elijah's character in terms so generous they made him blush to read them. But others were less charitable. There were whispers at the church social, sidelong glances in the mercantile, conversations that stopped abruptly when Elijah or Lucy entered a room. Some people couldn't understand why a man his age would want to take on the burden of raising someone else's child. Others had darker suspicions, the kind of ugly thoughts that flourish in minds too small to conceive of genuine altruism. Elijah heard the whispers and ignored them, focusing instead on the people who mattered and the task at hand. The home inspection came on a bitter December morning, conducted by a severe-looking woman named Mrs. Adelaide Crane, who had traveled all the way from Helena for the purpose. She walked through every room of the house with a clipboard and a frown, making notes in handwriting too small for Elijah to read. She examined the kitchen, the bedrooms, the barn, and the outbuildings. She asked Lucy dozens of questions about her daily routine, her education, her treatment by Mr. Thorne. Through it all, Elijah stood by silently, his hands clasped behind his back, feeling like a man on trial for a crime he hadn't committed. When the inspection was over, Mrs. Crane sat in the parlor and regarded Elijah over the top of her spectacles. "You have a clean home, Mr. Thorne," she said, her tone giving nothing away. "The girl seems healthy and well cared for, but I must ask you something, and I expect an honest answer." "Ask away," Elijah said. "Why do you want to do this?" She leaned forward slightly. "You're a man who has lived alone for years, by all accounts preferring solitude to company. Why would you suddenly want to take responsibility for a child you've known only a few weeks?" Elijah was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. It deserved more than a glib answer, more than platitudes about duty or charity. Mrs. Crane was asking him to articulate something he had barely admitted to himself. And if he couldn't find the words now, he might never have another chance. "Because she needed someone," he said finally. "And so did I. I just didn't know it until she showed up on my doorstep with that wounded dog in her arms." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "My wife and I, we never had children. It wasn't for lack of wanting. After she passed, I told myself it didn't matter anymore, that I was too old and too set in my ways to need anyone. But that was just fear talking. Fear of loss, fear of caring about something I might lose again." He looked toward the window, where Lucy was visible in the yard, playing with Rusty in the snow. "That girl has lost everything," he continued. "Her parents, her home, her whole world. But she kept going. She walked 60 miles through country that would kill most grown men, fighting off coyotes and sleeping in the cold, all to save a dog that was her last connection to the people she loved. That kind of courage, that kind of love, it deserves to be honored. It deserves to be protected." Mrs. Crane's expression had softened almost imperceptibly. "And what about her future? You're not a young man, Mr. Thorne. Have you considered what will happen to her if something happens to you?" "I've thought about little else," Elijah admitted. "I've already spoken to my lawyer about changing my will. If anything happens to me, this ranch goes to Lucy free and clear, along with enough money to see her through until she's old enough to manage it herself. She'll never want for anything, not as long as I have breath in my body, and not after I'm gone either." The inspector studied him for a long moment, something like respect dawning in her eyes. Then she made a final note on her clipboard and rose to her feet. "I'll be submitting my report to the welfare office tomorrow," she said. "I expect you'll hear from them within the month." And then, unexpectedly, she extended her hand. "Good luck, Mr. Thorne. I believe you're going to need it less than most." Christmas came to the Thorne Ranch with a quiet magic that none of its inhabitants had expected. Elijah had not celebrated the holiday in 5 years, seeing no point in decorating or cooking special meals for a household of one. But Lucy's presence changed everything. She asked tentatively one morning if they might cut a small tree for the parlor, and he found himself unable to refuse the hopeful light in her eyes. They trudged through the snow together, Rusty bounding ahead of them, until they found a perfect little pine on the hillside overlooking the valley. Elijah cut it down with 3 strokes of his axe and carried it home over his shoulder while Lucy danced beside him, her laughter ringing across the white landscape like bells. They decorated the tree with whatever they could find: strings of dried berries, ribbons from Mrs. Bennett's store, small wooden ornaments that Elijah carved in the evenings while Lucy watched with fascination. She had never seen anyone work with wood the way he did, his large, rough hands somehow capable of creating delicate shapes that seemed to emerge from the grain as if they had always been there waiting to be discovered. He made her a little dog that looked remarkably like Rusty, and when she hung it on the tree, her eyes shone with unshed tears of joy. On Christmas morning, Lucy woke to find a package wrapped in brown paper sitting beside her bed. Inside was a dress, the first new garment she had owned in over a year, made from the blue fabric Mrs. Bennett had set aside months ago. Elijah had arranged for the seamstress in town to construct it in secret, providing measurements he had obtained through careful observation and educated guessing. The dress fit almost perfectly, and when Lucy came downstairs wearing it, she looked so much like a proper young lady that Elijah had to turn away to hide the emotion on his face. Her gift to him was simpler, but no less meaningful. She had found an old photograph of Sarah in a drawer while cleaning one day, and had spent weeks secretly working on a frame for it, carving her own design into a piece of wood she had salvaged from the scrap pile. The craftsmanship was rough, the work of untrained hands, but the effort and love poured into it were unmistakable. When Elijah unwrapped it and saw his wife's face looking back at him from within that handmade frame, he sat very still for a long moment, unable to speak. "She would have liked you," he said finally, his voice thick. "Sarah, I mean. She always wanted children, and she would have loved you like her own." Lucy moved to sit beside him on the sofa, leaning her head against his shoulder in a gesture that had become natural over the weeks they had spent together. "I wish I could have known her," she said softly, "but I'm glad I know you." They sat together in comfortable silence while the fire crackled and Rusty dozed at their feet, and for the first time in years, Elijah felt something like peace settling into his bones. The house that had been so empty and silent was full of life again, full of purpose, full of the small daily joys that make existence worthwhile. Whatever happened with the guardianship process, whatever challenges lay ahead, he knew that this moment was worth everything he had risked to achieve it. The new year brought both good news and bad. In the second week of January, a letter arrived from the Territorial Welfare Office informing Elijah that his application for guardianship had been provisionally approved. There would be a final hearing in Helena in March, but barring any unforeseen complications, Lucy would officially become his ward by spring. The news sent Lucy into raptures of joy, and even Elijah allowed himself a rare smile as he read the official language that promised him what he had come to want more than anything else in the world. But the bad news followed close behind. A rancher named Silas Blackwood, who owned the largest spread in the county, had filed a formal objection to the guardianship. Blackwood was a wealthy man with powerful connections, the kind of man who believed that his money and influence entitled him to have opinions about everyone else's business. His objection cited concerns about the propriety of a single man raising a young girl, and he had gathered signatures from a handful of like-minded citizens who shared his narrow views. Sheriff Garrett delivered the news personally, his expression apologetic as he handed over the legal documents. "I'm sorry, Elijah," he said. "Blackwood's been making noise about this for weeks, but I hoped he'd let it go. He's got no real grounds for the objection, just prejudice and spite. Why would he care what happens to a girl he's never met?" Elijah asked, his jaw tight with anger. The sheriff sighed. Because you refused to sell him your water rights 3 years ago, and Silas Blackwood never forgets a grudge. This isn't about Lucy at all. It's about him finding a way to hurt you. The injustice of it burned in Elijah's chest like a hot coal. That a man would use an orphaned child as a weapon in a petty dispute over business dealings seemed to him a kind of evil he had not encountered before. He had known Blackwood was ruthless, had heard stories of rivals driven out of business and workers treated little better than slaves. But this was something different, something personal and cruel in a way that defied understanding. "What can I do?" he asked. "There has to be something." "Show up at the hearing with everything you've got," Garrett replied. "Character witnesses, documentation, the girl herself if the judge will allow it. Make them see what kind of man you really are and what kind of man Blackwood really is." He paused, his expression grim. "But I won't lie to you, Elijah. Blackwood has friends in high places. This fight isn't going to be easy." That night, after Lucy had gone to bed, Elijah sat alone by the fire with Rusty at his feet, staring into the flames and thinking about the battle ahead. He had never been a man who sought conflict, preferring the quiet satisfaction of honest work to the chaos of confrontation. But for Lucy, for the life they were building together, he would fight with everything he had. Silas Blackwood might have money and connections, but Elijah had something more powerful on his side. He had truth, and he had love, and he had the unshakable conviction that some things were worth any sacrifice. The weeks leading up to the March hearing passed with agonizing slowness. Elijah spent every spare moment preparing his case, gathering letters of support from neighbors and townspeople who were willing to stand against Silas Blackwood's objection. It was not an easy task. Many people who privately supported Elijah were afraid to put their names to paper, knowing that Blackwood had a long memory and a longer reach. But enough brave souls stepped forward to create a respectable pile of testimonials, each one speaking to Elijah's character and his obvious devotion to Lucy's welfare. Lucy herself seemed to sense the gravity of what was coming. She grew quieter as March approached, her natural cheerfulness dimmed by the shadow of uncertainty that hung over their future. Sometimes Elijah would catch her staring out the window at the snow-covered hills, her expression troubled in a way that no child should ever be. He tried to reassure her, to promise that everything would work out, but the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. He had learned too much about the world's capacity for injustice to make promises he might not be able to keep. 3 days before the hearing, disaster struck. Elijah was in the barn mending harness when he heard Rusty barking frantically, a sound he had come to recognize as the dog's alarm call. He dropped his tools and ran outside to find Lucy on the ground near the chicken coop, her face pale and her ankle twisted at an unnatural angle. She had slipped on a patch of ice hidden beneath fresh snow and fallen hard, the bone snapping with an audible crack that she said she would never forget. Doc Patterson came out from town and set the ankle with his usual competence, wrapping it tight and prescribing rest and elevation. But the timing could not have been worse. Lucy would not be able to travel to Helena for the hearing, would not be able to stand before the judge and speak on her own behalf. The very presence that might have swayed hearts and minds in their favor would be absent at the crucial moment. "You'll have to go without me," Lucy said that night, her voice thick with pain and frustration. She lay on the sofa with her bandaged ankle propped on pillows, Rusty curled protectively at her side. "You'll have to make them understand." "I don't want to leave you alone," Elijah replied. "What if something happens while I'm gone?" "Nothing will happen. Mrs. Bennett said she'd come stay with me, and Rusty will be here." She reached for his hand and gripped it with surprising strength. "Please, Elijah, you have to go. If you don't show up, Blackwood wins by default. Everything we've worked for, everything we've hoped for, it all goes away." He knew she was right. The hearing would proceed whether he attended or not, and his absence would be interpreted as indifference or guilt. But the thought of leaving her, even for a few days, felt like abandoning his post in the middle of a battle. She had become the center of his world without him even realizing it, and the prospect of facing that courtroom without her by his side filled him with a dread he could barely articulate. The morning of his departure, Elijah knelt beside the sofa and took both of Lucy's hands in his. "I want you to listen to me," he said. his voice steady despite the emotion churning beneath the surface. "No matter what happens in Helena, no matter what that judge decides, you are my daughter in every way that matters. Maybe not by blood, maybe not by law yet, but in my heart. Nothing anyone says or does can change that." Lucy's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. "You're my father too," she whispered. "The only one I have left. Come back to me, Elijah. Promise you'll come back." "I promise," he said, and sealed the vow with a kiss pressed to her forehead. The journey to Helena took 2 days by wagon, the road still treacherous with late winter ice and mud. Elijah traveled alone, his mind occupied with rehearsing arguments and anticipating objections. He had never been comfortable with public speaking, preferring action to words, but he understood that this battle would be fought with language rather than labor. He would have to find a way to make strangers see what he had seen in Lucy, to feel what he felt when he looked at her, to understand why their bond was worth protecting. The courtroom in Helena was larger and more formal than anything Elijah had experienced. High ceilings and polished wood gave it an air of solemnity that made his palms sweat and his collar feel too tight. He took his seat at a table near the front and watched it as other petitioners came and went, their cases dispensed with in minutes by a judge who seemed more interested in efficiency than justice. When his own name was finally called, his heart was pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. Silas Blackwood sat across the aisle, flanked by an expensive lawyer and wearing an expression of smug confidence. He nodded at Elijah with mock courtesy, a predator acknowledging prey that didn't yet know it was trapped. The hatred Elijah felt in that moment was so intense it frightened him. He had spent his whole life trying to be a good man, but faced with this embodiment of petty cruelty, he understood for the first time how easy it would be to become something darker. The judge, a stern-faced man named Harrison Whitmore, called the proceedings to order and invited Blackwood's lawyer to present the objection. What followed was an hour of insinuation and innuendo, questions raised about Elijah's fitness as a guardian without any actual evidence to support the concerns. Why had he lived alone so long? What were his true motivations for taking in a young girl? Could the court really trust the welfare of a child to a man so clearly unsuited for the responsibility? Elijah listened in silence, his hands clenched beneath the table, waiting for his chance to respond. When it finally came, he rose to his feet and faced the judge with all the dignity he could muster. "Your Honor," he began, his voice rough but clear, "I'm not a man of fancy words or legal training. I'm a rancher, plain and simple, and I've spent my life working the land my father left me. But I know right from wrong, and I know love when I see it. That girl, Lucy Brennan, she came to me with nothing but a wounded dog and a heart full of grief, and she gave me something I thought I'd lost forever. She gave me a reason to keep living." The courtroom fell silent as Elijah spoke, his words carrying the weight of absolute conviction. He told them about the night Lucy had appeared on his doorstep, about the desperate plea in her voice and the wounded dog in her arms. He described the long hours he had spent fighting to save Rusty's life, not because he expected anything in return, but because it was the right thing to do. He spoke of the weeks that followed, of watching a broken child slowly begin to heal, of discovering that his own broken heart was healing alongside hers. He talked about Sarah, about the children they had never had, about the emptiness that had consumed him after her death, and the unexpected grace that had filled it again. When he finished, there were tears in the eyes of several spectators, and even Judge Whitmore's stern expression had softened somewhat. But Blackwood's lawyer rose immediately, ready with more objections and more insinuations. The battle was far from over. What followed was another hour of legal wrangling, of arguments and counter-arguments that made Elijah's head spin. He answered questions as honestly as he could, refusing to be rattled by the lawyer's aggressive tactics. He presented his letters of support, his financial documents, his plans for Lucy's education and future. He laid bare his life for the judgment of strangers, holding nothing back because holding back might cost him everything. The turning point came unexpectedly. Judge Whitmore had called a brief recess, and Elijah was standing in the corridor trying to calm his racing thoughts when a commotion at the entrance caught his attention. The doors burst open, and there was Lucy, hobbling on a makeshift crutch with Mrs. Bennet supporting her on one side and Sheriff Garrett on the other. Rusty trotted beside them, his eyes immediately finding Elijah across the crowded space. "Lucy," Elijah breathed, rushing toward her. "What are you doing here? Your ankle, you shouldn't be walking on it." "I had to come," she said, her face pale with pain but determined. "Mrs. Bennet found someone with a fast wagon, and the sheriff agreed to escort us. I couldn't let you fight this alone. I couldn't let them decide my future without hearing from me." The judge, who had emerged from his chambers at the disturbance, looked at the scene with raised eyebrows. "Is this the child in question?" he asked. "It is, Your Honor," Elijah replied. "Lucy Brennan. She traveled 2 days on a broken ankle to be here." Whitmore studied Lucy for a long moment, taking in her crutch, her obvious pain, the fierce determination in her young eyes. Then he looked at Rusty, sitting alertly at her side, and something in his expression shifted. "Bring her in," he said. "I want to hear what she has to say." What Lucy said, standing before the judge with her hand on Rusty's head for support, was simple and devastating. She told the story of her parents, of their deaths, of the desperate journey that had brought her to Elijah's door. She described how he had saved Rusty's life when any other man might have turned them away, how he had opened his home and his heart without asking for anything in return. She spoke of the months they had spent together, of chess games by the fire and poetry read aloud on winter evenings, of the way he had taught her to see grief not as an ending, but as a season that would eventually give way to spring. "Mr. Thorne is the best man I have ever known," she concluded, her voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "He's not my father by blood, but he's my father in every way that matters. Please don't take me away from him. Please let us be a family." The silence that followed her words was profound. Blackwood shifted uncomfortably in his seat, his smug confidence finally cracking. His lawyer looked uncertain, clearly recognizing that no amount of legal maneuvering could counter the raw truth of what they had just witnessed. Even Judge Whitmore seemed moved, his pen hovering over his notes as he considered what he had heard. "Mr. Blackwood," the judge said finally, turning to face Elijah's adversary, "I have reviewed your objection carefully, and I find it lacking in substance. You have presented no evidence of impropriety, no legitimate concerns about Mr. Thorne's fitness as a guardian. What you have presented is innuendo and speculation, motivated by what appears to be personal animosity rather than genuine concern for this child's welfare." He turned back to Elijah and Lucy, his expression warming. "Mr. Thorne, your petition for guardianship is hereby approved. Lucy Brennan is now legally your ward, with all the rights and responsibilities that entails. May God bless your family." The words seemed to hang in the air for a moment before their meaning fully registered. Then Lucy was in Elijah's arms, laughing and crying at the same time, while Rusty barked joyfully and Mrs. Bennet dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. Even Sheriff Garrett was smiling, his hand resting on his gun belt in a gesture of satisfied justice. Blackwood slunk from the courtroom without a word, his expensive lawyer trailing behind him, and Elijah found that he could not even summon the energy to feel triumphant. All he felt was gratitude, overwhelming and complete. The journey home took 3 days, slowed by Lucy's injury and the spring mud that had begun to replace the winter snow. But neither of them minded the delay. They had the rest of their lives stretching out before them now, a future no longer shadowed by uncertainty or fear. When they finally crested the hill overlooking the ranch, the sight of the house waiting for them, smoke curling from the chimney, and the first green shoots of the kitchen garden pushing through the thawed earth filled Elijah with a joy he had thought he would never feel again. That evening, as they sat together by the fire with Rusty dozing at their feet, Lucy looked up at Elijah with an expression of perfect contentment. "We're home," she said softly. "Yes," Elijah replied, pulling her close. "We're home." Outside the window, the last light of day was fading over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Spring had come to Montana, and with it the promise of new beginnings. The rancher who had spent 5 years waiting to die had found a reason to live. The orphan who had lost everything had found a family. And the wounded dog who had started it all lay sleeping peacefully, dreaming perhaps of the night when a desperate girl had carried him through the darkness toward a light she could only hope was there. Some prayers are answered in ways we never expect. Some families are formed not by blood, but by choice. And sometimes the greatest gifts come to us disguised as strangers, appearing on our doorsteps with nothing but need and trust, asking only that we open our hearts wide enough to let them in.